Welcome in. About 30 seconds and let everybody trickle in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. It's great to see everyone here. Again, for our last CLEJ installment of the year. Alrighty, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the 11th installment of the Environmental Law Institute's Community Lawyering for Environmental Justice series about onshore renewable energy permitting. My name is Sarah Biken. I'm the manager of educational programs here at ELI. We have a fantastic program lined up for you today, focusing on project development considerations and impacts of onshore renewable energy. On behalf of ELI, I want to give a massive thank you to our speakers for lending us their expertise today and for preparing such an informative program. And of course, thank you so much to all of you in the audience who've joined us today for this conversation. ELI's Community Lawyering for Environmental Justice series is designed for attorneys to receive continuing legal education credit through practical education about the practice of law in relation to environmental justice. We've created a worksheet to go along with the event today, so please be sure to take a look at the written materials document on the event webpage. I'll post the link in the chat in a couple of seconds. There are also faculty biographies and PowerPoints from our speakers, which we encourage you to check out as well. Posting that now. Now, bear with me. I'm going to take a brief moment to go over the continuing legal education for this program. ELI is an accredited provider in Vermont and Pennsylvania, so the program is automatically approved for 1.5 hours of standard CLE credit in those states. ELI has not applied for CLE credit in any other states for this program, so please check your jurisdiction to see if they offer reciprocity with the states in which if you're seeking CLE credit in a state which does not offer reciprocity with Vermont or Pennsylvania, you will need to apply for CLE credit individually within your state. Within about a week of this program, we'll send out certificates of attendance to anyone who requests one. Certificates of attendance are used to verify attendance for CLE purposes, and in many cases, you might need these to apply for individual CLE credit. So to receive a certificate of attendance, you must be online throughout the entire program. We'll verify that using our software's attendance report. And you must also fill out the certificate of attendance request form. You should have already received this in an email, but we'll also post the link to the form in the chat. I'll do that towards the end of the webinar. In the request form, you'll be asked to fill out a brief course evaluation, as well as submit a specific code. This verifies your attentiveness. We will read the code out and post it. We will read the code aloud and post it in the chat at some point during today's program. If you have any questions about CLE, please don't hesitate to reach out to us on the email on the screen, cle@eli.org. That's CLE information covered, so great job, everyone. Now, our speakers will be taking audience questions during the program, so please submit any questions you have at any time using Zoom's Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to use the chat to share resources, observations, comments, etc. But please be aware that we will be pulling discussion questions directly from that Q&A box. Just makes it easier to track on our end. Part of what makes this series so great is all of your engagement, so we welcome any questions and would love to hear from you in the chat. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted publicly on the event webpage, which I did link earlier. It'll be up within a few business days, and you can find that recording and register for future installments of our Community Lawyering and Environmental Justice series at eli.org. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful moderator. Leading today's discussion will be Zoe Vogel, who is a public interest legal fellow here at ELI, where she previously served as a law clerk in 2022. Zoe received her JD with honors from Tulane University Law School, where she served as the editor-in-chief for the Tulane Environmental Law Journal, a student attorney with the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic, and as intersectionality chair for the Environmental and Energy Law Society. During her time there, she also held positions with the National Wildlife Federation, the Tulane Institute on Water Law and Policy, and Louisiana Center for Planning Excellence. Thank you so much, Zoe, for all your work in preparing and facilitating today's program. And with that, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for the lovely introduction, as well as all of our CLE information background. We are so lucky to be joined by three wonderful panelists today. We have Nadia Ahmed, Associate Professor and Coordinator of the Environmental and Earth Law Certificate Program at Barry University School of Law, Brenda Brickhouse, Technical Executive of the Equitable Decarbonization Interest Group at the Electric Power Research Institute, and Danielle Fidler, Senior Attorney of the Clean Energy Program at Earth Justice. We will hear from each of our presenters and we'll have about half an hour for questions and discussion at the end. As Sarah mentioned, if you have questions throughout the course of the presentation, please place them in the Q&A box and we will do our best to get to them all. Our presentation will begin with Nadia. Nadia Ahmed is a multifaceted scholar, educator, and advocate working at the intersection of environmental science, law, technology, and social justice. Currently an associate professor at Barry University School of Law, she teaches courses in environmental law, energy law, property, and business organizations. Her teaching philosophy emphasizes the interconnectedness of these fields in tackling real-world issues. Simultaneously, she is pursuing a PhD in environmental science at the Yale School of Environment, where her dissertation focuses on leveraging advanced machine learning techniques for climate and climate-induced conflict evacuations using satellite and drone data. Professor Ahmed's research explores the intersection of energy siting, the environment, and sustainable development, and draws on international investment law and corporate social responsibility. Before entering academia, she served as a legal fellow with the Sustainable Development Strategies Group, consulting for the World Bank and AusAid, and worked at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. She holds degrees from UC Berkeley, the University of Florida, and the University of Denver. And with that, I will pass it to you.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you also to Sarah. I think it's really important that, for everyone that's gathered today, and it's really important because we're looking at this importance of onshore renewable energy and the role of just transitions. It is really a really important point in terms of the transition for renewable energy. And what we wanted to look at is the jurisprudential dimensions of this change, as well as what is involved with onshore renewable energy development. And so the work that we focus on looks at the intersections of just energy transitions with property rights doctrine, environmental law, and energy justice, and also seeing the different frameworks for being able to facilitate, as well as to prevent ways that are trying to impede positive or optimal outcomes for a necessary transition for renewable energy infrastructure. And so some of the work that has been done also overlaps with economic policy. So economic policies can support the development of innovative financing mechanisms, as well as a way for disadvantaged communities to be able to access clean energy development, as well as infrastructure projects. One of the ways that we do this in the research that we're doing on just energy transitions in place, which is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, looks at how geography can also improve this, particularly focusing on how law and the permitting process can be used to really leverage it for communities who are very vulnerable to environmental hazards, and also by prioritizing investments in those areas. There's quite a bit of industrial transition literature that can look at how previous energy policies have also contributed to the marginalization of certain communities and inform the development of having better and more equitable policies going forward. Another area that we draw on looks at sociology as a way to provide insights into social and cultural factors that can influence success of just energy transitions, as well as how legal frameworks can also incorporate these factors by also including tools to enhance all communities' access to clean energy incentives. And these tools can also be helpful to community leaders and their dissemination of information about these incentives. What it also does is helps broaden government communication across different areas of distribution, just beyond having the internet available. Historically marginalized communities and other communities are also vulnerable to sea level rise, especially, for example, I'm based in Florida. We have a low water table. We also have extreme weather events and natural disasters. So all of this makes it really even more imperative to make sure that we're deploying technical and financial knowledge into the work for energy development. And one of those issues is important to think about access to funding, having developed business models and partnerships in areas that would be able to expand any types of gaps for project development, design, and implementation. And so we found that in our research project that we did on just energy transitions in place, we found that it's really important to engage local communities in project development because this will actually work to prevent unintended consequences and also lead to a more integrated community-led approach for energy transitions, both in the interim and in the long term. And so community engagement also reduces the uncertainty and creates a stable policy environment to encourage investment in low carbon energy technologies. And this is, I think, applies across the board to really in any industrial or commercial sector development, especially that involves infrastructure development. The more that there is engagement with the local community, the better outcomes that there can be. And it requires some bit of organizing and development at the forefront. And so when we apply this concept of community engagement and development to the transition to onshore renewable energy, you're also able to see that you can address energy insecurity, climate change, and systemic inequalities. So what I wanted to do is kind of walk you through a couple of examples to show you historically how some of these projects can take a long time to get done, and then also how you can have somebody with concentrated resources stop an energy project from happening. So the first example I wanted to give you is the Chokecherry Sierra Madre wind energy project. I started researching about this as I was entering the academy over 10 years ago, and only last summer was the project able to get full regulatory approval at the cost of over $400 million in permitting and legal maneuvering. And the Telluride project that I will share with you shows you how a single landowner was able to block access between private property rights as well as public energy needs. And so what you'll find interesting is you're going to see a convergence of interest groups on two sides of the extreme. On one side, you will have groups that are very pro property rights. Then you will have another one that are very pro conservation, energy, environmental and land sovereignty. And so both of these groups can really merge together to really support in some ways that they may not normally do so. And so energy easements, which was the focus of my research, was on how essential it was for being able to transport electricity over long distances. And that itself requires a fundamental rethinking because many of these easements prioritize the rights of energy developers, but often overlooked those of environmental justice in communities that were impacted. And we also found that it was important to reconceptualize energy easements as a tool for broader equity that could help balance some of the competing interests. And so when we look at the legal frameworks that are brought forward under the National Environmental Policy Act, known as NEPA, we can see that there's actually existing safeguards in place for NEPA. So what NEPA does, NEPA includes a no action alternative, which allows agencies to assess the environmental impact of halting a project. However, it's also it's very rarely been used to truly halt harmful environmental projects. But what it does do, it actually makes it possible to have stronger or more environmentally sound decisions through the NEPA process. Like the more rigorous and robust the NEPA process is, the better environmental outcomes there are. And so then in the next part of my talk, I wanted to turn to this idea of responsive regulation and equity, which I started focusing on more around 2016 and 2017. And so this idea of responsive regulation provides a flexible approach to lawmaking. This is when you would engage stakeholders and to be able to adapt to new challenges. And so when you have changes, for example, in various presidential administrations, this can have an impact on how renewable energy development occurs. And so if there is opposition from local communities about land use and ecological impacts, there can also be important to bring in other components to that. For example, one of those may be workforce equity. And so being able to transition workers from declining industries, including fossil fuel industries like the coal sector, to renewable energy is really important. And so there has to be a few steps that are taken versus just being able to start planning and citing a project. And so these policies also have to include training programs and incentives to ensure that those who are most impacted and affected by energy transitions aren't going to be left behind. The Energy Policy Act, as well as updated NEPA guidelines, can also address, also kind of step in to address these issues, but there's still going to be some gaps that remain. So for example, for Indigenous communities, the stakes can often be higher, and projects like the Dakota Access Pipeline really showed the risk to tribal sovereignty and environmental justice when consultation processes were considered inadequate. And we could also see as well some of the concerns for being able to strengthen tribal rights in energy project negotiations. So then I also wanted to kind of turn towards the technological and economic opportunities that are present in renewable energy. And so the Choke Cherry and Sierra Madre wind energy project was where there's very high quality wind in Carbon County, Wyoming. The problem is that there was a low population density there for the development. So the developers of the project, led by Phil Anschutz, who had really developed quite a fortune doing oil and gas development, wanted to turn toward cleaner energy sectors. And so the project was seeking to develop a transmission line that would travel 700 miles from Wyoming into Nevada. And when they first started to do the project, they weren't even sure if they would be able to connect to California, but there's this saying like where there's a will, there's a way. So they started working on the permitting and the construction and approval. And they also, meanwhile, there was another project that was related to it that was supported through the Berkshire Hathaway. And so for both of those projects together, for them to get the regulatory approval, it took over $400 million in 10 years to get approval. And so this was one of the largest wind projects in the world and in the United States at the time that it was being conceived, and it would have been capable of powering over 1 million homes. So even though there was quite a bit of energy potential, there was a lot of concerns also from the community about wildlife conservation and land use concerns. And there was also concerns within Wyoming because many of the residents including cattle farmers and ranchers, they did not want to have a wind energy project because they were used to oil and gas development. And so they took these wind farms as a threat to their way of life. And so that was another component of the opposition. But there was also a lot of financial innovation as well involved in these projects because they built out public-private partnerships, and they also developed tax incentives to really improve the renewable energy projects. And then in the other example I wanted to share with you, which was in Telluride, Colorado, was brought forward by Francis Bacon, and he was a New York hedge fund manager, and he had purchased two adjoining parcels which were previously owned by like the Forbes family. And so at the time of the purchase of the property in 2007, it was the largest residential real estate transaction in the history of the US. One of the issues is that there was an energy easement that was held by utility companies. And shortly after the land sale transaction went through, the utility companies also got approval to build their transmission line. But in this case, the owner of the property, or the new owner, he was able to find out that the energy that was being touted as a green energy project wasn't in fact green, clean energy like solar energy. It was actually what they would call clean coal. And so he also mounted a $10 million public relations campaign to really halt this transmission line, which he argued would impact his aesthetic view of the property that he owned. And then at the end, he was able to be successful because he launched not only a media campaign, but he also launched a legal campaign. And he was really successful in both of them. And at the end of it, he was able to also obtain close to $10 million tax credit by placing the properties in the conservation easement to also to have the tax benefits for that. So these were kind of two scenarios, where one where it took a long time to get approval and it was quite costly. And then the other one, you had somebody with very concentrated resources that was able to prevent this large project from moving forward against powerful utility companies. And then the couple issues that I also wanted to address is about land use and community impacts. So land use is one of the most contentious aspects of renewable energy development, because communities often resist the projects because they perceive them to be disruptive or unjust. For example, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline really underscored the importance of respecting Indigenous land and sovereignty. We also saw with the renewable energy projects having to align with local values and needs. This also requires quite a bit of extensive community consultation to occur and having transparent decision making. So these siting decisions also have to account for ecological and cultural harm that would be occurring. And so a few of the policy recommendations that I wanted to share before I end is that we need to really think about how we would develop comprehensive frameworks for national frameworks for standardizing energy easement law. And this would work to reduce conflicts as well as having clearer pathways for renewable energy projects. Even though there are some concerns about this, I think it's really important to also strengthen the consultation process with marginalized and indigenous communities. This would also make it so that their voices would be heard and having their rights respected. It's also important to really enhance and really highlight NEPA's no action provision to really better understand environmental baselines and also empower agencies to halt projects that they think would pose significant ecological risk. And the fourth policy recommendation is to really increase investments in workforce development and equitable financing models to support a just transition. And so I hope by understanding these case studies of the choke cherry and the Telluride conservation easement, you can have a better sense of how to navigate some of these land use and regulatory frameworks and community impacts. Then I'm also going to share with you links to a few articles, which I'll just drop them in the chat. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Up next, we have Brenda Brickhouse. Brenda is a thought leader in energy and environment. As a technical executive at the Electric Power Research Institute, she leads EPRI's Equitable Decarbonization Initiative and supports EPRI's Strategic Sustainability Science Program, Energy Sustainability Interest Group, and Sustainability Assessment Services. Brenda is involved in research efforts characterizing priority sustainability issues on the intersection of sustainability and enterprise risk management, optimizing sustainability in decision-making and investments, and understanding the equity implications and opportunities associated with decarbonization and the clean energy transition. Prior to joining EPRI, she worked as Chief Sustainability Officer at the Tennessee Valley Authority and held environmental, operational, and leadership roles in the utility industry and in consulting. She received a Bachelor of Science in Forestry and Master of Public Affairs from NC State University and a Master of Energy Regulation and Law from Vermont Law School, where she focused on energy and environmental justice. Thanks so much, Brenda.
Thank you. It's great to be here and great to be with you all. Before we move to the next slide, I'll just point out there's a link there at the bottom that that shows EPRI's environment and sustainability, particularly energy equity and environmental justice work is summarized and mostly can be found on that website. So that's a little bit more background. So let's talk about decarbonization. If you could move to the really first slide, next slide, or well, let's talk first. Talk a little bit about EPRI. So, nonprofit public benefit corporation. focused on thought leadership. We're independent, objective. Certainly that we have deep scientific and industry expertise. And the large part of EPRI's work is collaborative, right? Bringing together members, funders from utility companies, foundations, state and local, well, not that much local, state and federal investments to be able to do this research. It's really that the innovation in everything from generation technologies, operations, grid infrastructure, as you might imagine. But also we have a group of folks that I work with that are focused on sustainable energy strategy, electrification, environmental stewardship, and that's the piece that I'll be talking mostly about today. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the transition that we're involved in right now. And really thinking about it, there are tremendous opportunities, and it's rare that we've had one of these kinds of crossroads, I think, in the industry. And I'll say I've been in the industry for over 40 years, but really thinking about the intersection of our awareness and understanding much better of social justice and social issues with the opportunities that with the clean energy transition is providing. And so disadvantaged communities can certainly benefit from the clean energy transition. Nadia spoke to that very eloquently before about some of those opportunities in terms of renewed policy focus to help with clean energy access, innovative financing, and really supporting folks through workforce development and others to create that just transition. And thinking about affordability, and particularly with the transition and climate challenges that we're facing, are going to continue to be challenges. So we think about equitably distributing those costs, right? Those costs and benefits. It's that distribution of burdens and benefits that we really think the most about. But it really takes deliberate planning and program implementation. And so planning projects that we talked about, as well as planning programs that utilities and state and federal governments can apply and that folks can benefit from, is an important piece of the transition that we're a part of. And certainly public and private sector decision-making really are directly impacting equity and environmental justice. And that would go everything from developers, renewable energy developers, transmission lines, all the way down to end-use customer rate design, electrification, access to electric vehicle charging, all that, from end to end in the energy system. And then the key part, and Nadia spoke to this too, really ensuring that distributive and procedural justice are at the forefront. They're really a lens through which we think about this transition, and we think about the projects and the programs and all those pieces and parts that will pull this together for the energy system and for the consumers and customers across the U.S. in particular, but in particularly across the world. And there are new analytical tools, demonstration projects, really need to focus on delivering early benefits. The point about the folks concerned about changing their view sheds, quality of life, land use, some of those kinds of concerns are very real. And then potentially there are preconceived notions or just unknowns that folks don't understand and need better access to information, need better access to see how these projects come together on the ground, how they impact communities and households and individual landowners. A lot of that information is really not known until it comes to your doorstep, and then you don't know who to trust, right? And so that's an important piece that we think can help advance the clean energy transition, is by giving folks opportunities to see what this really looks like on the ground and in reality. So let's go to the next slide and talk about just a couple of things. The next two slides are excerpts rather, from a publication that we did that really looks at equity across the energy system. And so thinking about renewable energy, wind and solar, there's that opportunity for impacts, right? There's the noise and disruption from construction. There are certainly impacts to sacred and culturally significant resources or lands. And then potentially the other, at the far end, right, there are impacts from decommissioning. I won't read all of these to you. I just wanted to highlight a few of them. Actually, I'll highlight actually a couple more. So thinking about competition for agricultural lands, particularly for solar, that I think, I live in Tennessee. That is certainly an issue here, and it's an issue across the United States and elsewhere. And there are opportunities that go along with many of these impacts, right? And so thinking about some of those opportunities, we'll flip to the next slide. So some of those opportunities are thinking about green space, right? Planning for green space and those biological connections, particularly for transmission lines. The use of the lands underneath the transmission lines can be quite varied, but there are potentially opportunities for looking at some of those community needs and community connections that those linear facilities could potentially provide. We've heard about the access to low-cost clean energy, particularly for consumers for whom affordability is a problem, low-income customers and others. There are opportunities for agrivoltaics. EPRI's done some work in this as well as others in terms of how to design and site and maintain solar farms that can indeed also accommodate livestock, pollinators, other kinds of vegetation management that would be advantageous for the landowner as well as for the community. And we can also increase resilience in vulnerable communities. And I think that's a key part, right? To the extent that we have renewables energy facilities going in, then thinking about those, the potentially they way, like the example of Sierra Madre, building a project in Wyoming that's going to serve Nevada and California and beyond doesn't necessarily do a lot for the community that's the host community for those facilities. But there would be potential with some of that infrastructure to be able to improve the reliability and resilience of those host communities. And that's an important thing to think about, particularly as we face increasing weather extremes, increasing extraordinary weather events in terms of everything from tornadoes to hurricanes and beyond and others, increasing the reliability and resilience in those key communities, particularly rural communities that can be impacted and then consequently experience lengthy outages because they take a long time to access and to repair. Some of these facilities could be supplemented with investments in microgrid technologies and others that would support those communities where they are. So those are just a few of the examples. These, I would say that the link to this document is on these slides. It's good. It's not exhaustive. So these are places to start off. We crowdsource the information that's in this document, and it hopefully is a place to start with ideas when you're going to be developing a project or thinking about public policy relative to how these facilities can get permitted and built. These are some good hard looks at some of those impacts and opportunities to then think about and prepare for or mitigate for that could be helpful in going in the future. So let's take a look at the next slide and think about how do we really advance acceptance of some of these projects, right? Nadia mentioned it. Community engagement is really number one. Transparency, building trust, right? Involving the community is the next piece to this. If you think about these almost in terms of a spectrum of engagement, collaboration, using local vendors, providing local jobs, involving the community in the projects is a good way of advancing acceptance. Access, right? Does the facility provide local clean energy? Is it supplying or local, more reliable energy to a community? And are there multiple uses for those spaces, right? There was I don't remember the name of the facility, but there was a brownfield solar facility, community solar facility going in Detroit. And we're going to install a solar field across this brownfield, pretty much a great big city block. But the community needed community spaces as well. And so involving and engaging the community, talking through the plans for the project, they were able to carve out and have community space and recreational and gathering space along with the solar farm that was on the bulk of the community, the bulk of the block. So those kinds of compromises, those kinds of thinking about the broader aspects of any facility or development that's under consideration can very much help the community accept that facility. And then finally, really community ownership is one of the best ways to think about building wealth in communities that can be income producing for the community themselves, and those innovative financing tools can really do that. So, it's easy sometimes, to think about that we might think we know what communities want, but certainly what we have found in our research and what we have found in working with utilities across the nation are that what we think we know may or may not really be what the community needs, right? And so talking to the community, listening to the community, finding out what they really need can go a long way with then developing mitigation for the project, because there will be burdens and benefits, and really thinking those through for the benefit of the community as well as for the project developer. So let's look at the next slide and dig in a little bit more on what does that meaningful involvement in the community really look like? Sort of how would you do that? And so starting early, you really cannot start too early. So I know that we work again with utilities and thinking about integrated resource planning. And that's the process whereby utilities will look at their suite of resources, the loads and needs from the system, and then and then figure out what are the most sort of economic and technically feasible solutions to those to meet the needs in the future. There are those integrated resource planning processes are typically geography agnostic, right? They don't really look at where is something going to go. However, even that early, most of these facilities are going to go adjacent to existing facilities, replacing existing facilities, coal plants closing down and building a solar farm or some other kind of alternative energy, battery storage on that site. You think about those sites that already have infrastructure, they already have access, they already have a local workforce. So those kinds of places are certainly likely places where new development and new infrastructure or renewed infrastructure would go. Now, not all of those facilities were cited originally with these considerations and environmental justice concerns in mind, but those are the kinds of places that in that early scoping, before you've even selected a site or even thought about where it might go, getting to know those places, getting to know those communities, and getting to know those people can go a long way in terms of future development and future changes to the infrastructure that may happen in those places. So identifying disadvantaged communities, ground truthing. I've got a slide in just a minute I'll talk about very briefly in terms of mapping tools, but really going out there and finding out what's on the ground and who's on the ground, meeting with local leaders and seeking out those underrepresented voices. Those that homework, if you will, and that relationship building takes time. And then proactively engage with those communities, enlisting participants, building capacity in those communities to participate in these processes. These legal and regulatory processes are not intuitive, and they are not for the faint of heart, and they take time and resources. So for communities to be able to participate, particularly disenfranchised communities, takes a lot of capacity building. Transparency, there's enough said on that. And bringing all those regulators with other key stakeholders along throughout the process. Nadia spoke about was it 10 years and $400 million? Those processes really, can get bogged down with folks coming in late, and really starting early, and that proactive engagement can be an important piece of it. And so learning the community's needs, definitely plan for contingencies. This is not an easy answer or a quick answer by any means, but being open to those unexpected solutions. Like I said, the example in Detroit, thinking about community open space and community space needs, not just turning a brownfield into a solar farm, which in and of itself sounds great, right? And then the last thing is really following through on those plans and mitigation. Sure way of destroying trust would be to make promises that aren't kept, right? So on the next slide, very quickly, we just wanted to, you'll have access to these slides. These are some of the key mapping tools that we use and others. EPA's EJ screen is the one there at the bottom that is probably the most prevalent, but there's a lot of learning that can be had from these other tools as well, particularly if we're looking into projects that can enhance resilience and thinking about some of the other aspects and characteristics that we can learn about communities. I want to go back to something that was said on the previous slide, though. Ground truthing is important. And so these mapping tools, they're called screening tools for a reason, that they're not perfect, but they certainly can get you headed in the right direction. And then lastly, I want to go back to a point on the next slide that I mentioned before about engagement and capacity building. And so the passive approaches really may not, and I would say do not, yield our desired results, right? You know, and I cut my teeth in this industry in doing transmission line siting, and we would hold open houses, and you'd have them in the evenings at a local school or community center or something like that, and put a notice in the back in the day in the newspaper and expect people to come. And even today, right, we've got the internet, everyone has access, gee whiz. Well, everyone doesn't have access, right? And so really thinking about those avenues for communication. How do we get folks involved in these projects, aware of these projects? How do we enable them to bring their voices to the table and enable them to not just bring their voices, but enable them to learn about how these projects work, how does infrastructure work, and then really engaging in a more meaningful dialogue to be able to work out what the burdens look like, what do the benefits look like, how do we mitigate for the burdens that can't be avoided, right? And some of this capacity building can be about logistics, providing transportation, scheduling meetings when your target folks can come, or scheduling different meetings where different folks can be able to come, providing childcare, right? Those kinds of things are important. If you're talking about potentially a community advisory council, bringing people in that are going to be, of a longer duration and spending time on the project, educating those folks on energy infrastructure, providing a stipend, right? We pay experts, biologists, archaeologists, engineers to work on these projects. The folks that we're bringing in from the community bring their lived experience. They're experts in their community. Why would we not pay them to participate just alongside with the other folks who are working on the project with them? And then internet access and computer equipment, particularly for folks that likely have cell phones, but may not have, particularly low-income individuals, may not have access to tablets or laptop computers or sufficient internet access at home and Wi-Fi to be able to read materials, to understand, have access to meeting minutes, access to information about events and things like that. So with that, that's a pretty quick and dirty overview of some of the research we've been doing and some of the work that we've been doing at EPRI with utilities. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenda. And before we jump into our final presenter, Danielle, I do have the CLE code for you all. And this will also be put in the chat, but the CLE code is CLEJ1224. All right, and then that will pop up in the chat as well. All right, so next we have Danielle Fiedler, who is a senior attorney with Earth Justice's Clean Energy Program. She is a member of the program's FERC practice, which focuses on reforming the nation's electric system to ensure a level playing field for clean energy resources and unburdening frontline communities from the ongoing harms of fossil fuel power plants. Her portfolio includes transmission planning, capacity markets, and resource adequacy issues, primarily at the federal level and in the Northeast to Mid-Atlantic regions. Before coming to Earth Justice, Danielle previously served as an assistant attorney general with the New York Attorney General's Office and a senior enforcement attorney with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, where she specialized in complex enforcement cases. Danielle was a member of the U.S. Department of Justice's Deepwater Horizon oil spill trial team and also served as a Brookings Fellow to the Senate Finance Committee. Danielle has a BA from Bryn Mawr College and a law and master's degree from George Washington University. Thanks, Danielle.
Thanks so much, Zoe, and thanks to you and Sarah and Christine and Madison for inviting me, and to Nadia and Brenda for being on this panel. I just want to say, Brenda, like, I think that's the quick and clean version of community lawyering, and I'm really excited to talk today, sort of like taking what Nadia and Brenda were discussing and sharing how we at Earth Justice use those principles as, you know, like concrete litigators and community advocates. Just for those who may not be familiar with Earth Justice, we're the country's largest nonprofit environmental and energy law firm. We represent primarily community clients and other nonprofits in the environmental and energy spaces. So our clients do not pay for us. And we bring you know, a lot of people here, you know, the earth needs a good lawyer, but we really view it as the communities need good lawyers. And so our work is very community oriented. Just the practice, just to touch a little bit, our practice, there's the Clean Energy Program, which deals with public utility commissions, and the FERC practice, or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is this tiny commission that actually has so much power over, you know, the environment ultimately, because it regulates the energy sector. And we also have a really great policy and legislative team. And we've worked on kind of the gamut. We worked on Dakota Pipeline. We've worked on the infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act. Sorry, after you get into the abbreviations, you start forgetting what they mean. So we take a holistic approach to our advocacy, both in court, in states, in communities, in legislatures, state, local, and federal. So if we could go to the first slide, I just wanted to talk about some concrete examples of like the scale, the opportunities and challenges in this space, and the interplay between sort of local problems and clean energy and federal regulatory rules designed to help solve them. So I just wanted to touch, I think Brenda and Nadia covered this really well, and I just wanted to sort of remind people of the scale of the issue. Energy justice isn't a small field. If you look on the top left, the proportion of the population residing in a disadvantaged community in some places like New Jersey is half the population. So, you know, this isn't a niche field. The need for community justice is really significant across the country, and in both, you know, urban areas and rural areas. There's there's a lot of environmental justice issues at play. And then there are a number of states in the bottom left, you can see that, like California, Illinois, New York, Washington, that have passed laws that specifically require certain percentages of investments in clean energy go to communities, to disadvantaged communities. And the federal, the Biden administration also has a Justice 40 requirement that has a similar 40% of the investments are to be directed to prioritizing unburdening disadvantaged communities. And then I just, Brenda's talked about, you know, her model is very similar to the one that's on the right. Just want to touch on one of the additional core tenets of this work in the first slide. We talked about distributional and procedural justice. Recognition justice is also recognizing that people come from different backgrounds, sort of the intersectionality of our perspectives. And you know, part of that listening and getting to know each other is also treating those perspectives as equal. And I really loved Brenda's point about we pay the technical experts, we pay the lawyers. We also need to be paying our community representatives who are bringing critical experience that others don't have, and that needs to be treated equally. So that was something I wanted to highlight. And part of the goal of all of this is looking at the life cycle of the energy system and trying to make sure that we're, you know, looking at justice at every step of the way. And with the goal of restoring the harms that we have traditionally been causing to these communities, and going forward in ways where, you know, there's a democratic, you know, investment of everybody, and trying to get on equal footing in bearing benefits, burdens, and also getting to make the decisions. So if we could go to the next slide, I just wanted to talk about, like, so two broad examples. The first one is in the context of tribal engagement. So if you look on the left, these graphics come from DOE National Transmission Needs Study, and it's identifying how disproportionate the lack of access to electricity is in Native communities. And you can see there's like a very significant percentage of tribes that do not have access to electricity, do not have access to the grid. And then if you look on the right, this is referenced in that report, but this was data produced by one of the national labs showing the potential for, on the top, solar, and on the bottom, wind energy on tribal lands. And you can see it's quite significant. In fact, there's an estimate that this could be up to like 6% of potential contribution, but on less than that, the land would be less than that. So one of the things that has been in terms of this area, the difficult, so there's a big opportunity to put in resources that could address the first problem, and provide clean energy, and also provide means, you know, for the tribes to have control over that. However, there's no transmission, and these would be big transmission wires and very expensive to build. So I just want to talk about a couple of things that are in the some of the federal efforts recently to deal with this. Under the Federal Power Act, Section 216A, so you're getting your CLE credit now. Every 3 years, the Department of Energy has to assess the transmission needs of the country, and as part of that, they can then designate what's called a National Interest Electricity Transmission Corridor, or a NITC. And essentially what you're looking at is parts of the country where we need to prioritize building electricity, and to serve areas that either have congestion constraints that adversely affect consumers, or they're expected to have those constraints in the future. So the NITC process is really sort of like the DOE studies it. There are opportunities for communities to be involved in feedback. So there's always an opportunity for public comment on these reports to let the government know where there are transmission lacks and congestion, high prices that need to be addressed. If one gets a NITC designation, which there aren't tons of them every year or every 3 years, but if you do, then that unlocks, in the recent IRA and IIJA laws, that there's a lot of funding, and in particular, there's been $2.5 billion grants for states and tribes to increase their resilience for their grid and to get transmission. And there are a lot of other tools that, a lot of other sources of money as part of that legislation that is really historic investments in bringing much needed transmission to rural rural areas especially, but also overburdened communities that need to get off of really dirty power plants. So Earth Justice worked with our coalition partners and with some of the tribes to push for NITC designations in areas that would unlock transmission access. We also pushed in on the Atlantic seaboard that would prioritize offshore wind transmission, because there's less space to develop onshore renewables, but the transmission is necessary to take down highly polluting plants in New York, New Jersey, some of the cities along the eastern seaboard. Those actually have been accepted in the preliminary designation for NITC. So we're excited to see if they make it to the final. We're really hoping that will help the communities be involved in having access to this. I do want to touch briefly, it's in the materials, the excellent materials that Zoe's provided, Section 216B of the Federal Power Act gives FERC permitting authority if states do not approve these transmission corridors in the NITSEs. And importantly, there needed to be regulations about what that's going to mean, because a lot of times when you're permitting something, especially in the Natural Gas Act context, we've seen communities be railroaded, and the Dakota Pipeline Access lawsuits were an example of that. So that's a new rule that came out from FERC this year. It's Order 1977, and a nod to the environmental justice movement. And it really, just among the features is that there's a landowner bill of rights for, while the transmission can be sped up, there's also requirements that affected communities be involved in good faith efforts and be part of the decision making. And it does include requiring developers to prepare environmental justice public engagement plans, to have a tribal resource report, an engagement plan where the tribes have to be engaged, and there are limits on what can be done if you don't have tribal authority. So those were important changes that my colleagues, I want to be very clear, pushed for with our community partners. And we're very excited about those changes. If we could go to the next slide. So to flip that in an urban area in New York City, we've seen, this is a map on the left. You're seeing impacts from pollution from bus terminals in New York City. This is a decades-long effort from one of our partners in New York, We Act, that looked at some of the real sources of asthma in disadvantaged communities. And if you see on the map, you can see the darker yellow and it gets to dark brown. These are communities that are disadvantaged communities that have high rates of asthma hospitalization. And over time, the community came together and really pushed MTA to eventually adopt a electrification of its entire fleet by 2040 plan. And on the right, you can see the priorities where MTA is going to prioritize first its investment in those electric bus systems. What I didn't include on this map, because my technical skills of layering one thing onto another are limited, on the left, you also have peaker power plants in those same areas with the high asthma rates. These peaking plants are often over 50 years old and often have no controls whatsoever. And a peak power plant is used only at the highest demand, like the hottest day of summer or the coldest day of winter, when you're trying to make sure that there's energy on the system. So they only run about 5% of the time, but they cause about 85% of the NOx, of the ozone pollution that's really affecting the communities. And there was a direct correlation between the disproportionate COVID impacts and the location of these bus, the multiple environmental pressures and pollution sources. So one of the difficulties in this space, and another group we've worked with, the P Coalition, has also documented with air pollution monitoring, the impacts of the peaker plants on these communities. One of the challenges is, as you electrify, you're growing the load. And the problem is that New York is extremely constrained, and you can't build new, you can't have new utility scale solar farms. You actually need to develop resources either upstate or out in the ocean, and there's very limited transmission to do that. So trying to deal with one problem can create another problem. As you're electrifying for cars and transportation and building, you're also increasing the load on these plants that are also harming the community. And the key to that is transmission planning. So FERC, after several years, just issued Order 1920, I guess a reference to the Jazz Age, but it was actually when the Federal Power Act was first passed. It requires a holistic planning of both expected load, expected generation, and also compliance with state laws, regulations, and goals, including environmental justice requirements. So you have to consider both what's going in and how to manage the system and make sure you have a transmission grid that can serve all of the needs and meet these requirements. There are also some state laws in New York. There's the Rapid Act, which actually speeds up permitting for transmission projects, which are designed to help unburden communities, but also while respecting community engagement. There's also, we didn't talk about it a lot, but there's lots of opportunities for community benefit agreements where the project is contingent upon working with the community to figure out, as Brenda was talking about, what is it they want, what is it they need, how can you have two things happen at once. And so I just want to stop there, mindful that there's lots of questions that are probably coming up, but I think one of the really key challenges throughout this space is that you really have to look at the whole system, and you really need to have everyone at the table. Part of Order 1920 that is very exciting is that there is a lot more transparency and there are a lot more opportunities for public input, but there's still a lot of difficulty for the community to engage effectively in that. There are lots of proceedings. It takes up so much time. It's technically very complex. You have to understand the modeling that goes into what is the load. Is that an accurate assessment of what the load is going to be? What are the generating requirements? Have we really thought out whether or not like new nuclear could actually get permitted? So you have to truth test that. You need the communities on both ends to be involved in planning for the system, and especially planning for a system that is meeting the requirement that 40% of the benefits go to disadvantaged communities first. If you're not planning for taking down those plants, it won't happen. And we've seen this happen in New York recently, where plants that are legislatively required to shut down are now being kept running because if there's a threat to reliability, and that will trump every law you pass. If the system is going to shut down, basically kind of gets thrown out the window to keep the lights on. So I think that's something just to keep in our minds as going forward, that how complex this work is and how important it is. So I'm really excited for those who are attending this, and I hope that we get more folks in this space.
Thank you so much, Danielle and Brenda and Nadia as well for your presentations. Like Sarah mentioned, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We have a really great context setting question to sort of set us off from Jennifer, who says, as someone who works in renewable energy permitting and EJ, I very much appreciate these presentations. Is the construction of a renewable energy facility in a disadvantaged community / environmental justice area inherently positive? I feel the issues may be more complicated. Love to hear your perspectives. So with that, I will open it to you three.
So I'll start. No, is the short answer, right? I mean, it's, depending on what it is, it's still an industrial land use. And it also is whatever that renewable energy facility is going back to NEPA and the no action, right? What other opportunities would that piece of property have had? And so certainly when we think about, say it's one of those peaker plants in New York that Danielle was talking about, the asthma concerns and all that, putting that new, could be battery storage, it could be something else on that site, yes, benefits the local ambient air quality. But that doesn't necessarily make it okay, right, for the community. There's still going to be this big gray bulk of a thing, whatever that visual or that land use issues may be, need to be considered and mitigated. It still may be the best place to replace that peaker plant with a battery storage facility. All good, right, in terms of reliability, better air quality and all that. But still may need to be some concerns that the peaker plant, maybe that block doesn't have sidewalks. And what the neighborhood really needs is better access and mobility and sidewalks. Put in a sidewalk with the battery facility, that kind of thing to think about.
I agree with that. And I would just add that there was a recent example of one of the clean energy hubs that's coming into New York, up in Mott Haven, which is one of the just most heavily affected communities with multiple sources of pollution. So while bringing in a new transmission hub that will allow clean energy to come to New York City is a great thing, they were initially proposing to put it right next to a school. So I think the other thing that's really important and why you want to bring the community in and not try to shortchange the process of like, let's just railroad this, let's get rid of NEPA, let's, make it faster, is that all of that, basically by opening it up to the community, they ultimately decided that actually there was another industrial area nearby that would be a good place for it to go, right? So, and then the community got a benefits agreement out of it and they got some things too. So the point is like bringing people in gets buy-in, and that's, then you reduce your litigation risks. But as Brenda was saying, you also get sidewalks or like a multi-use end result. And we are seeing a lot of like storage facilities that are doing nice designs, putting green walls and sidewalks and things to make a space that used to look terrible actually pleasant. So that only comes with community involvement.
Thank you. I would add also that to think about kind of globally as well what the impacts are of renewable energy with critical mineral developments. For example, like if you're mining for lithium in South America, it's going to also cause water scarcity and harm the local ecosystems. So I think we should also think about, the environmental harms, but also the potential for exploitative labor practices. And I think also this occurs across industries, whether even if you look at the agricultural sector or even or like textiles and other types of manufacturing or food preparation. And so I think we can also think about like culturally significant sites as well, which can be impacted. Like if you have a solar farm that's going to replace agricultural land, that would also displace the like local farming communities. It would disrupt their livelihoods. And actually, we're seeing that happening in Florida. Like some of the lands that are protected, like having low density agricultural production is a lot better than having heavy industrial residential or commercial development in terms of like the land use and environmental impacts. But because of the extreme weather events with the hurricanes, like just Hurricane Milton alone produced 50 tornadoes before the hurricane even made landfall in Florida. And this really has a devastating impact on agricultural lands because the flooding takes away the season's harvest and even has longer term impacts. And so it's not financially feasible to continue agricultural on some of these lands. So they're switching over to potentially solar farms. And so then that also creates job loss and also has impact on the soil for the community. And so like I think we also think about like if you bring in these renewable energy projects even into EJ communities, as how would it impact like property values and how would it maybe lead to gentrification as well within EJ communities? Would it like have would the project have jobs for those who are living within the community, or would those jobs have to come from outside the community? So I think it's important to think about the economic opportunities that could be created, but also for a community that may not have economic opportunities, they may have to choose between options that may not be good at all.
Thanks so much. Danielle, we have one follow-up question. You described moving the project from a school area to another industrial area. Someone is curious if anyone sued challenging the project after it was moved.
I'm going to be honest, I don't know. I'll have to, I mean, we haven't been involved in any suits involving it, but I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go look. But as I've said, like there's a lot of, I think the investment of community support. I think one of the things is to realize that everybody understands that there's a benefit and a burden. So I think the assumption that there's always going to be NIMBYism is inaccurate. And that's why it's just super important both to realize that, like, it's not always good, but communities can come together and recognize that, like, that sometimes, this is, how do you make the best of a situation that, you're kind of, as Nadia was just saying, sometimes there's not a good choice, but how can you make, something where everyone comes out, 100% fine, but how can you mitigate burdens in ways that can, be managed and get community acceptance and support.
All right, so our next question is a little bit of a heavy hitter. How stable do you anticipate the renewable energy industry to be in the next administration? And I would also tag on there, if you have any thoughts or expectations around NEPA generally, or the permitting process, and whether we expect to see that change, and what the impact of either making that a more intensive versus less intensive process is.
So I may be closer to some of the developers in the industry than others. So I'll start the first question. I'll say this one, I'm speaking just as Brenda and not as EPRI. But when we think about the transition to clean energy, and we think about the aging infrastructure that we have, and particularly a lot of the coal plants in this country are quite old and not economical to keep running, right? And so that in and of itself is certainly a driver for closing coal plants, replacing them with newer facilities. And in this case, we're all talking about clean energy facilities of different sorts. And so that momentum, I don't see subsiding. Brenda doesn't see that subsiding. The other thing is, too, is it's not just what sort of government regulation and government policy is driving, but very much about what customers are driving. And so to the extent that, the biggest load growth in the country right now is tremendous in data centers. We should do a whole one of these on that. But to fulfill that demand, we're going to need a lot more megawatts. And so, and those data center developers are demanding clean megawatts for those data centers. So that's what's going to get built, right? So it really is, it's not just the federal policy drivers, but there are economic as well as customer driven drivers to maintain the transition that we're seeing.
I would add, and I think it's really important that the market is really a driver in renewable energy development. Just like Brenda said, I think that, like, where the market goes is where the demand is going to continue. And if we're, like, looking at renewable energy projects, I think you are going to see less funding in terms of subsidies, grants, and research funding. You may also see some attempts to roll back tax credits for solar and wind projects, and promote coal-fired power plants. But one of the things to note is that from the Inflation Reduction Act, about 60% of that funding went into red/purple states. And so many of those states don't want to give up that funding. And so you have less of a likelihood of seeing an actual rollback even on the Inflation Reduction Act. You are also going to see some attempts at deregulation as well. So that could lead to some slowdown in renewable energy development. You could also see a weakening of the renewable portfolio standards at the federal level. And so I think I think that would be something to watch. And then also what the Supreme Court has also done with environmental regulation, that's also going to have a real impact as well.
I think one of the biggest concerns going forward is that there will be an attempt to roll back a lot of, there was already discussion about streamlining NEPA on the Hill during the last session, which President Biden supported, and and we didn't, because we oppose the idea of leaving communities out for this very reason that we've been discussing. So we have a lot of concerns about efforts to basically take out Justice 40, for example, anything that's designed to benefit disadvantaged communities. We are concerned about the funding for that being cut, the policies being held back. We will, of course, our Earth Justice has a long history of fighting in court to prevent federal rollbacks. So I think the other big concern is the IRA funding is likely, like one of the difficulties is that if there's a big tax cut, the money for that has to come from somewhere. So we're, looking at like where just what the incoming administration has said their priorities are. Their priorities are in developing oil and gas. So that's been, that is of concern to us.
And we have another follow-up permitting question. Some states and jurisdictions are facilitating clean energy through exemptions or other streamlining of permits or regulations. What are the panel members' thoughts on the impacts of this approach and how various stakeholders might make a difference in this situation?
I would jump in here that I think that it's really important to think about how local advocacy work is going to be done going forward, because EJ communities really organize and have a lot of latitude in terms of how that they can really aim for policy work. For example, in 2017, through the work that we did at the American Bar Association, we were able to get the ABA to support a federal environmental justice policy act, which during the Trump administration had a 4% chance of passing, and during the Biden administration only had a 2% chance of passing. And so I think that which was because if it had a higher likelihood of passing, is that the chance of it actually passing decreased. And so I think you're going to have a period where you can think about really more robust and stronger ways to leverage state policy. You're also going to see a lot more investment from the private sector, and as well as support from communities, which you may not have seen before. And that may make a way for more legal preparedness in terms of how renewable energy developers can develop more robust compliance with NEPA in ways that they had not done before. When I mentioned about responsive regulation, it's really the market is driving the level of regulation that will be happening. And even the oil and gas sector is supporting renewable energy development because they were a primary beneficiary of much of the funding under the Inflation Reduction Act in terms of tax credits. So I think that you also see the CEO of ExxonMobil saying that he supports the U.S. staying within the bounds of the Paris climate framework. So I mean, I think that this is where like there's some advancements that have happened. A lot of people don't want to back on them.
I would point out one more thing in terms of community engagement early in permitting. If there's a fatal flaw in a project's plan, you really want to find that out sooner than later. And so oftentimes that early community engagement can ferret out those issues that, like I said, could be historic sites, could be culturally sensitive sites, a variety of things that could come up that can be learned through community engagement earlier than later.
I would just add one more thing, like local and state politics has always been, they say the crucible of innovation. And I have found that to be true. I have found that people are far less partisan on a local level. State level, not necessarily, but I do think, a lot of, as Nadia and Brenda were saying, there's already a lot of investment in so-called red states and so-called, fossil fuel companies are already invested in this transition as well. But I think so there's a report that came out just the other day, I think it was we didn't write it, but laborers in New England are thinking about like investing their pension funds in developing these resources. So what I'm saying is like there's a community, and that in a way is exactly the kind of democratization of ownership that is what you want, is that those who are building this are benefiting from it, and we're investing in our own infrastructure as a population. So I think that the movement of being invested in a clean energy future, especially when it is cheaper to build and doesn't have all of the pollution, I think all of us want clean air and clean water, and we want to have spaces and that we enjoy and a good quality of life. And I think we're philosophically, people want that regardless of party alliance. And I think there's a lot of opportunity at the local and state level to keep advancing regardless of the national politics.
Great, thanks. So we have just a few more questions in the Q&A, which will probably take us to our time. But one, what about EJ disadvantaged communities in U.S. territories like Puerto Rico with outdated and severely depleted power grid and energy infrastructure? Are they currently receiving any federal assistance under the IRA to implement renewable energy projects? And Danielle, they also ask, if so, could Earth Justice be able to help? So I'll leave that to you to answer.
I will be candid. I am not. We certainly are aware of the horrifying, lack of response after Hurricane Maria. But I don't. Send me the information via email, and I'm happy to like follow up on it. But I personally do not work on Puerto Rico issues, so I don't know that off the top of my head.
All right. Our next question, are there particular technical considerations in the construction of renewable projects that might make local contractors less desirable compared to larger firms with renewable specific experience? Are there policies or practices such as local subcontractor requirements that could address such an issue? I think that goes towards the workforce conversation that we've been having generally.
Yeah, I'd say the short answer is yes, particularly solar. You don't, the skill sets for solar are not unlike any electrical contractor, right? And then there's also some foundation work and installing piers and piles and that kind of stuff. So very much can be a local workforce. Wind is a little more specialized, and so that's probably would be more difficult. But there are also, ancillary subcontractors and other things, everything from sanitation supplies, who you rent the porta-johns from, to catering for food and all kinds of things. So certainly opportunities and to be mindful of and intentional in leveraging that local supply chain.
Nadia, do you have anything to add on that one?
I just wanted to add in that I think that I think there's other examples that you'll see in terms of how local content requirements have worked out well. And so the local content requirements, they could be specific economic development incentives that would really support larger scale industrial growth, and also thinking about the goal would be towards having energy security as well as energy access. For example, in Canada, they have the Green Energy Act, and what that also does is it promotes local manufacturing focused on energy. And these requirements were kind of put in place, but then they've also faced some controversy. In Australia as well, there was some concerns because the government wasn't providing local content requirements as well for the wind energy sector, and it caused a risk to jobs that were already existing within the area. And there's also concerns, I think, that may show up with trade issues. And I'm not like a precise expert on renewable energy and trade in terms of the local content requirements, but I think that's something also that needs to be factored in.
Thanks so much. This will be our last question before we give each panelist just a couple minutes for any concluding remarks or final reflections. What are the proper pathways for including tribal or indigenous populations in the process? Are there viable options for energy sovereignty or a more inclusive process?
Well, I can just add, and I mentioned that, I mean, there are multiple processes, but certainly for siting of transmission, as I mentioned, the FERC Order 1977 requires that developers have specific tribal resource and engagement plans. So there is a requirement that the tribes be consulted, and not just consulted, that they have to be part of the process. And that is a really important step. We were really glad that that got added to have more recognition of tribal sovereignty. But I think one of the key things to think about is like, there's still not great knowledge. I mean, there's still like the communication with tribes, like really have to build relationships that last over time. You can't just kind of go in and say, oh, hey, I'm here to build something, like, who do I talk to? That doesn't work with any community, and especially not a sovereign nation, right? So it's so critically important that any developers be building the real relationships with communities that don't even have anything to do with the project yet. You're just building the relationship so you understand the perspective, so that when you get to the point where you're talking about a project, that you already have a relationship that can have an authentic exchange and input.
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to P&M, Public Service New Mexico. They've changed names recently to something else. Anyway, but so that's the utility, and serves much of New Mexico, also a little bit of Texas. They have tribal liaisons that work for the utility, who are tribal members, though, that work with the Navajo and other tribes. And so where independent power producers, developers may not have those relationships, the local utilities probably do. And so that's just something to think about in terms of who's doing what to whom, and some of those contractual agreements, and what the utility can help the independent power producer do or not is, I'm not speaking to all that, but that's a model for how those relationships can be fostered. And we've talked to those folks and spent a considerable amount of time in that area. And the desire to be a part of this clean energy transition, particularly for those nations that are losing, they had coal mines, they had coal plants, they had, folks working in those facilities, and those facilities are getting closed down. What is that next thing that they need for economic development, for jobs, for keeping folks within in those nations and not having to go elsewhere for work, and being able to, in some ways, being able to participate on a level playing field relative to other developers, to utilities, access to the transmission system. All of that is an opportunity to be able to lift up what those tribes can participate in and grow wealth and income from.
Great, thanks so much. We're getting a little close to our time, and I know Sarah has some concluding words, but I would like to take the time to go around, maybe just in the order of presentation, for any final closing remarks.
Thank you. I would just highlight that it's important to think about precision when we're imagining renewable energy, because specifically for onshore renewable energy, when you have these technologies like onshore wind and solar photovoltaics, you can really mitigate climate change impacts. And it really is a way to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. But I think we also have to think about how we would harmonize it with international trade obligations and market dynamics, and seeing what we can do in terms of the gains that we've had on renewables, and how environmental and local ecological degradation is also a factor. And I think I'm hopeful, because there's a lot of new technologies that are coming out that are really going to shift the paradigm for renewable energy. And so we're really reaching that critical stage where we're having public acceptance. And so I think that the future is bright.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the future is bright. And I think that, the emphasis from my career and history in this, as well as the research that we've done, is really having those meaningful conversations of all parties involved, right? And that is the key to avoiding litigation at the end of a project. It really is the key to planning and developing a better project. And so that would be my my closing thought to leave.
I would just add that, I hope folks listening get into this practice. I think community lawyering is one of the best things to do as a lawyer. And those relationships that you build, it's my favorite client, is people and communities, and hearing them out and trying to make things better. And I think it also requires patience, because change can take a long time, but it does come usually. And so I think there's that element of learning to be in it together through the highs and the lows, and just keeping your eyes on the prize. So I look forward to working with hopefully all of you in this space.
Thank you all so much. Sarah, do you have any?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Nadia, Brenda, Danielle. That was a fabulous discussion. And thank you to Zoe for being such a great moderator. We appreciate all of you for joining us today. And thank you again, audience, for your engagement. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions. Hopefully we'll be able to do some follow-up programming on related subjects in the future. I've put a link to the certificate of attendance request form in the chat. The first section is just a brief course evaluation, and the second will ask for that CLE code, so don't forget it. I know the end of the year is almost upon us, so we'll try to get those certificates of attendance out to you ASAP next week. And then if you have any questions or you need anything as you apply for CLE, please reach out to that email I put in the chat as well. If you couldn't attend the full webinar today, you'll be able to watch the recording on the event webpage within a few business days. You can also find the links to the prior installments of this series on that page as well. We hope to see you at our future programming in 2025. And for now, we hope you have a great rest of your year and a great weekend. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.